Hi, my name is Yulia and by training I'm a plant evolutionary biologist. And in my free time I'm really passionate about gardening and recently I've become very fascinated by botanical symbolism. And in this channel we explore how flowers became words. So last time we talked about how flowers transformed into language across human history. And today we're going to talk about one specific flower that actually means something different to almost everyone who ever grown it. The rose. The rose. Every major civilization has cultivated it and every single one attached different meanings to it. And this isn't random. This is the story how humans took one plant, cultivated it, and turned it into the mirror of their deepest beliefs. So let's start at the beginning. Some drink would be nice. Roses are old, and by old I mean really old. We are talking like 35 million years based on fossil records. They started in Central Asia and spread naturally across the entire northern hemisphere. China, Europe, the Middle East, wild roses showed up everywhere. And humans started cultivating them around 5,000 years ago. And here's what's really interesting. So these cultures developed their rose traditions completely independently. They had no contact to each other, but they were still decided that the roses were worth cultivating. Cool, huh? All of those cultures started building different meanings around them. And one of the oldest archaeological evidence includes these imageries of the Minoan frescoes. And those are approximately from around 3,700 years ago. So now let's talk about the actual roses people are growing, the old varieties. Those are not the modern hybrids, rather those are ancient varieties that shaped everything that comes after. Let's start with the Rosa gallica. This one comes from Central and Southern Europe and the Greeks and Romans were already growing it. It has incredible fragrance and it blooms once per summer. The most famous variety is Rosa gallica officinalis, and you might know it as the Apothecary rose. Medieval monks grew this one specifically for medicine, so it wasn't just pretty, it was actually pharmaceutical. Then we have Rosa damascena, the Damask Rose. This one comes from Syria and reached Europe during the Crusades, so we're literally talking the flower that traveled with the armies. Why? The fragrance. This rose produces some of the most complex scent compounds in plant kingdom. Some of the countries like Bulgaria, Iran, Turkey, they still grow fields of those for rose oil and rose water. And this is a multi-million-dollar industry based on flower that's been cultivated for over 1,000 of years. So next we have the Rosa chinensis, and here's where it really gets very interesting. So Rosa chinensis was domesticated in China. Just imagine, Chinese gardeners had been growing this over a millennium before the European even knew those existed. And when they finally made it to Europe in 1700s, they changed everything. Because unlike the European roses varieties that just bloom once a year and they're done, Rosa chinensis blooms over and over. And this genetic trait became the foundation for almost every modern rose we can buy in the stores today. Hybrid teas, floribundas, they all trace back to this Chinese rose. Next, let's talk about Rosa moschata, or the Musk rose. The Musk rose probably came from the Himalayas or the Middle East. And by the 1500s, it was in Europe and even Shakespeare was writing about it. It has white flowers, it's fragrant, it blooms later than other varieties, and breeders absolutely loved it. And this one is the genetic background for a lot of modern shrubs. The next one is Rosa alba. Rosa alba is ancient, even Romans knew about this one. It's probably a natural hybrid between Rosa gallica and Rosa canina. It has wild to pale pink, extremely fragrant flowers, and they bloom once in early summer. This flower was a symbol of purity across multiple cultures. Now, Rosa centifolia is the interesting one because it's not ancient in the wild. The Dutch breeders created it in 1600s. but it became iconic very fast. You know those Dutch still life painting with the huge dramatic roses? That's centifolia. And the name actually means 100 petals, and that's not an exaggeration. It has really massively complex flowers and incredible fragrance. Next one is Rosa foetida. Rosa foetida came from Western Asia in Europe in the 1500s. It has bright yellow flowers, and here's why it matters. Before this, roses did not come in yellow. This was a genetic source. So basically every yellow rose that you see today, it traces back genetically to the Rosa foetida. The last one is Rosa banksiae or Lady Banks rose. It's native to China and it came west in 1800s. This is a climbing rose with no thorns and it clusters small white or yellow flowers. And the fun fact that the largest rose bush is in Tombstone, Arizona, and this is the Rosa banksiae. That thing is massive. So those are the plants, or the ancestor of those plants. Now let's talk about what people did with them culturally. And we will start with ancient Egypt. And rose petals actually show up in Egyptian tombs. Egyptians also made rose wreaths for funerals, but this was more in the Roman Greek times. But the most famous Egyptian rose story involves Cleopatra. And according to historical accounts, she covered the floor of the palace room 30 centimeters deep, that's around the foot, in rose petals before receiving Mark Antony. And the strategy was deliberate. Every time when he would smell roses afterwards, he would think of her. This is how you can use flowers as a psychological warfare. Egyptians also used roses practically. They boiled the whole roses to create balms that protected skin from the harsh climate. Now let's talk about China, because Chinese rose history is massive. Roses have been cultivated in China for over 5,000 years. The Han Dynasty, ruling from 141 to 87 BCE, had extensive rose cultivation. For example, even Confucius wrote about roses grown in the Imperial gardens and mentioned that the Imperial's library contained hundreds of books just about roses. Just think about it. Hundreds of books dedicated to one flower, and that all over 2000 years ago. Crazy. In China, roses symbolized eternal spring and longevity. Not just romantic love like in the West, but actually immortality and prosperity. Red roses represented luck and good fortune, which is why they show up in Chinese weddings and the New Year celebrations. So roses were about wealth and well-being, not just about emotions. And what is interesting about China, that you remember we were talking earlier about the Rosa chinensis, the Chinese horticultural, researchers, they were able already to have this knowledge to select for this trait, which is multiple blooms per year. And it happened like 1,000 years ago. Crazy. Japan has a different relationship with roses. Wild roses called nobara have always grown there naturally. But here's the thing, roses were never the star flower in Japan. Roses came to Japan from China as a garden crop in the 12th century. But Japanese culture preferred lotus, chrysanthemums, camellias, and sakuras. Roses were mostly used for making rose oil and perfume. And what's fascinating is that when European roses varieties arrived in Japan much later, they actually made a huge impact. The garden rose got a new name, bara, and suddenly it became very popular. Japan even developed the world's first blue rose in 2004, which they called applause, as a symbol of achieving something impossible. In Japanese hana kotoba, the language of flowers, roses have specific meanings. Red roses mean love, similar to Western culture. But yellow roses can signify decrease of love or friendship, which is very different from modern Western meaning of jealousy. Pink roses represent grace, happiness, or gratitude. Now let's move on to Persia. Ancient Persia by the 5th century BCE had turned rose cultivation into an art form. They created these elaborate geometric gardens called paradise gardens. And yes, that's where the word paradise actually comes from. Roses were central to the whole design. But here's what's different. Persian poets like Hafiz and Rumi, they weren't writing about roses as romantic flowers. Rather, in Sufi mysticism, the rose represented something divine, like the god, divine beauty. The petals reflected spiritual truth, and the thorns symbolized the pain of being separated from the divine. The Ottoman Empire took Persian rose traditions and scaled them up into the imperial symbolism. Ottoman sultans built massive rose gardens in Istanbul and Edirne. They developed Damask Rose cultivation in the Isparta region, which, by the way, is still one of the world's major producers of the rose oil. Also, Ottoman art is full of stylized rose motifs called hatay, ceramics, textile, architecture, roses everywhere. And it wasn't just decoration. Roses marked civilization itself. Rose water in cuisine, rose oil in perfume, roses in poetry. The tulip gets more attention when we talk about Ottoman culture, but roses were arguably more embedded in daily life. And the Greeks had completely different take. They connected roses to Aphrodite and human desire, not divine transcendence. The mythology is wild. One version says wild roses turned red when Aphrodite pricked her foot on thorns, rushing to her dying lover Adonis. Another version says roses grew from her tears mixed with his blood. Either way, Greeks made roses about passionate mortal love, about beauty and suffering happening together. Same flower, completely different worldview. Then Christian transformation happened. So Christianity took the rose and rewrote it again. Red roses became blood sacrifice. White roses symbolized Virgin Mary's purity. Gothic cathedrals put rose windows in the architecture. The rosary gets its name from rose garden. And every religion that encountered roses projected its core values onto them. Now fast forward to Victorian England. So they took all this fluid symbolism and turned it into the rigid code. In Language of Flowers books, which was basically this flower language florography dictionary, red roses mean passionate love. White roses mean purity and secrecy. Yellow roses mean jealousy or infidelity. Pink roses mean grace and admiration. And these weren't suggestions, these were rules. And this matters more than you might think. Victorians transformed roses from the cultural symbolism that could mean different things in different contexts into the fixed vocabulary words with stable definitions. And then British colonial influence spread the system globally, and we're still living with this domination. When you buy roses today, you're probably references Victorian meanings whether you realize it or not. And this Victorian codification didn't just happen in a vacuum. Carl Linnaeus' taxonomy system became the global framework. Indigenous names for roses got lost. Take the Damascus rose. People across Middle East had been cultivating it for thousands of years with their own regional names. And European botanists showed up, classified it as Rosa damascena, done. And this pattern repeated across the world. So European flower language didn't just coexist with other symbolic systems, it displaced them through colonial institutions, botanical gardens, and international commerce. Today, when someone in Tokyo or Cairo or Sao Paulo buys roses, they're usually referencing Victorian meanings, not just their own cultural traditions. And here's what's amazing. If you have roses in your garden, you're growing all of this history. For example, that red hybrid tea rose traces its genetics back to Rosa chinensis from China. And the climbing rose on your fence might descend from Rosa banksiae, which has been cultivated for over 1,000 years. Fragrant pink rose connects to Rosa damascena, brought to Europe during the Crusades, and still grown for perfume in Bulgaria and Iran today. Rosa gallica officinalis, for example, still produces the same medicinal compounds that medieval monks harvested. Rosa centifolia is still supplying perfumeries in grass. The yellow in modern roses all traces back to Rosa foetida genetics from Western Asia. And if you want to grow those heritage varieties in your garden, you have to understand how they evolved. For example, you want a well-drained soil with a lot of organic matter. This will replicate the conditions of those gardens they were developed in. You don't need to water them too frequently because this will allow to grow better roots. They don't need to be pruned too much, only a little bit after the blooming, because the hard cuts can destroy the growth patterns. It is also recommended to not to use the synthetic fertilizer, because those synthetic fertilizers were mostly designed for modern varieties. And with this, I would like to conclude. So what does it all tell us? The rose shows how a single plant species become a vessel of human meaning-making across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. Every civilization that encountered roses projected their deepest beliefs and values on them. The Persian mysticism, Greek mythology, Christian theology, Ottoman imperial power, and Victorian social codes, layer after layer of meaning accumulating over time. But globalization really compressed all this diversity. Now we just have basically the commercially standardized meaning that dominates how the world understands roses. On one side, it is a big loss, but on the other side, it's practicality. What do you think? Maybe there is a way to preserve this complexity even in our globalized and interconnected world. Now, I hope maybe you can look at your garden roses differently, that they're actually carrying centuries of the accumulated meaning, whether you see it or not. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.